Cop insults old veteran at restaurant. Gets epic payback. Detective Mike Reynolds drummed his fingers against his steering wheel, his jaw clenched tight enough to make his teeth ache. The evening air was thick with summer heat, and his air conditioning struggled to keep up. Just another thing that wasn't going his way today. He'd spent the afternoon getting chewed out by Captain Martinez about his aggressive approach to interrogations, as if being nice to suspects would get results. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. The neon sign of Tony's Diner flickered ahead, a beacon of greasy comfort food and coffee that was probably burnt to hell. Mike needed something in his stomach, and Tony's was the only decent place still open at this hour. He pulled into the parking lot, tires crunching over loose gravel, and killed the engine. Inside, the diner hummed with the quiet conversation of the regular crowd. The smell of French fries and coffee hit him as soon as he opened the door, along with the blast of too cold air conditioning that Tony always kept cranked up. A few faces turned to look at him, then quickly turned away. Mike was used to that reaction. People in town knew him, and not many of them were fans. He didn't care what they thought. These small-town folks were stuck in the past, resistant to change, always complaining about how the police force wasn't like it used to be. Mike was proud to be part of the new generation of officers, the ones who got results instead of wasting time with community outreach and friendly chats over coffee. The vinyl booth squeaked as he slid into it, and Sarah, one of the younger waitresses, approached with visible reluctance. "Coffee?" she asked, already holding the pot like a shield between them. "Yeah," Mike grunted, not bothering to look up from the menu he'd already memorized months ago. "And the burger special." As Sarah hurried away, Mike's attention drifted to the back of the diner. An elderly man sat alone by the window, his reflection ghostly in the darkening glass. The guy wore an old army jacket despite the heat, decorated with patches and pins that spoke of long-ago service. Mike had seen him around before. John Willis, one of those veterans who couldn't seem to let go of their glory days. John stared out the window, lost in thought, occasionally lifting his coffee cup with slightly trembling hands. The other customers treated him like some kind of local celebrity, always stopping by his table to chat or shake his hand. Mike had overheard enough of those conversations to know John loved telling war stories to anyone who'd listen. The sight of John's military decorations made Mike's mood darken further. He thought about his father, another veteran who'd spent years telling Mike how being a cop wasn't what it used to be, how the new methods were ruining the force. His father and men like John Willis were all the same, stuck in the past, judging the present by their outdated standards. Mike's coffee arrived, and he took a sip of the bitter liquid, grimacing at the burnt taste. His eyes kept drifting back to John, irritation building with each glance. The old man's presence seemed to represent everything that had gone wrong today. The captain's criticism, his father's disappointment, the town's resistance to his methods. A couple walked past John's table, stopping to exchange greetings. The woman's voice carried across the diner. "Thank you again for your service, Mr. Willis." John smiled politely, but Mike could see the rehearsed nature of his response, the practiced humility that made everyone love him so much. Something in Mike snapped. Maybe it was the stress of the day, or maybe it was just seeing one too many people fawn over another hero who probably spent more time telling stories than actually fighting. He stood up, coffee cup in hand, and walked toward John's table. "Must be nice," Mike said loudly, his voice cutting through the diner's ambient chatter. "Living off old stories while the rest of us do the real work, keeping this town safe." The diner fell silent. John looked up slowly, his weathered face impossible to read. A few other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but nobody spoke. Mike could feel their eyes on him, could sense their disapproval, but he was too far gone to care. "You war vets think you're something special," Mike continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "But your time's long past. The world's moved on, old man. Your stories don't mean anything anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning the atmosphere. John's hands, still wrapped around his coffee cup, had stopped trembling. His eyes, clear and sharp despite his age, met Mike's with a steadiness that should have been warning enough. But Mike was too caught up in his own anger to notice the strength in that gaze, or to recognize that true warriors rarely needed to prove themselves to others. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft clink of silverware and the hum of the ceiling fans. John didn't respond, didn't rise to the bait. He simply sat there, his dignity intact, while Mike stood foolishly with his cooling coffee, waiting for a reaction that wouldn't come. Tony, the diner's owner, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. His face was dark with anger, but before he could speak, John raised a hand slightly, a small gesture that somehow carried enough authority to keep Tony quiet. The old veteran's silence spoke volumes, making Mike's outburst seem even more childish and unprofessional. The moment stretched until Mike couldn't stand it anymore. He turned away, dropped some money on his table for the untouched burger that Sarah was just bringing out, and stormed toward the door. As he left, he could hear the gradual return of conversation, but it was quieter now, subdued. He'd managed to poison everyone's evening, including his own. The parking lot gravel crunched under his feet as he walked back to his car, his anger already beginning to mix with something else, something that felt uncomfortably like shame. But he pushed that feeling down, started his engine, and drove off into the darkening evening, telling himself that he'd done nothing wrong. After all, somebody needed to tell these old-timers the truth about their place in the modern world. Behind him, through the diner's windows, John Willis continued to sit quietly at his table, his coffee growing cold, his eyes now focused on something distant that only he could see. The other customers gradually returned to their meals, but the atmosphere had changed. Something had been broken, and nobody knew yet just how that break would heal. The diner's atmosphere remained heavy long after Mike's departure, like the air before a storm. John Willis sat motionless, his coffee forgotten, hands now resting flat on the table to hide their slight tremor. He'd faced worse in his life, much worse, but there was something about public humiliation that cut deep, no matter how many years you'd lived or battles you'd survived. Around him, conversations slowly resumed in hushed tones, punctuated by occasional glances in his direction. John could feel their pity, their anger on his behalf, and somehow that made it worse. He didn't need their sympathy. He'd survived war, lost friends, rebuilt his life. He could handle one angry young cop with a chip on his shoulder. Still, the words stung in ways he hadn't expected. Sarah, the young waitress, approached his table cautiously. "Can I get you anything else, Mr. Willis? Maybe some fresh coffee?" Her voice was gentle, almost maternal, despite her being young enough to be his granddaughter. John managed a small smile, but shook his head. "No thank you, Sarah. Think I'm about done for the evening." His voice came out steady, decades of military discipline helping him maintain his composure. Tony emerged from behind the counter, wiping his hands nervously on his apron. The diner owner had known John for years, had heard countless stories about his service, and had always treated him with respect. Now, Tony looked uncomfortable, caught between his role as a business owner and his friendship with John. "That was way out of line," Tony said, pulling up a chair uninvited. "I should have thrown him out the moment he opened his mouth." "I'm sorry, John." John waved off the apology. "You've got nothing to be sorry for, Tony. Some people just carry their own battles inside them. Sometimes those battles spill out onto others." A few tables away, a group of regulars were still discussing the incident in angry whispers. John could catch fragments of their conversation, something about calling the police department, filing a complaint. He wished they wouldn't. Making a fuss would only escalate things, turn a moment of thoughtless cruelty into something bigger than it needed to be. The sun had almost completely set now, casting long shadows through the diner's windows. John watched as the streetlights flickered on outside, one by one, like stars appearing in the evening sky. It reminded him of nights long ago, in places far from home, where artificial lights were dangerous and the real stars burned bright enough to navigate by. Memory had a funny way of sneaking up on you when you least expected it. Tonight, before Mike's interruption, John had been thinking about Tommy Martinez, a young man from his unit who'd never made it home. Tommy had been about Mike's age, full of that same angry energy, that same need to prove himself. The resemblance had struck John even before Mike had opened his mouth. More customers trickled in as the dinner rush began, each new arrival catching snippets of what had happened from the regulars. The story grew with each retelling, and John could sense his role in it shifting from target to symbol, the disrespected veteran, the humble hero. He didn't want any of that. He'd learned long ago that real respect wasn't about symbols or stories. It was about actions, about how you treated others when no one was watching. An older couple at the next table kept shooting him concerned looks between bites of their meatloaf special. The husband looked like he wanted to say something, probably offer support or share his own veteran status. John focused on his cooling coffee, trying to project an air of calm that would discourage conversation. He didn't have the energy for well-meaning sympathy right now. Linda, Tony's wife, emerged from the kitchen with a slice of apple pie, setting it down in front of John without a word. It was her way of showing support. Food had always been Linda's language of comfort. John nodded his thanks, but couldn't bring himself to eat it just yet. The pie reminded him of another memory, more recent than Tommy. Last Veterans Day, the diner had hosted a small gathering. Mike had been there too, standing awkwardly in his uniform while other officers chatted with the veterans. John remembered thinking the young detective looked lonely, out of place. Maybe that's what tonight had really been about. Not just anger at the old guard, but a deeper disconnect, a failure to bridge the gap between generations of service. "You don't have to stay, you know," Tony said, returning to check on him. "Your money's no good tonight, anyway." John shook his head. "Running away never solved anything, Tony. Besides, this is my place too. Been coming here longer than that young man's been on the force." The diner's regular sounds gradually returned. The clinking of cutlery, the sizzle of the grill, the chime of the bell above the door. Life went on, as it always did. John had learned that lesson the hard way, in places where tragedy and normalcy lived side by side, where you had to keep moving forward no matter what. Finally, John reached for his wallet. Despite Tony's protests, he left his usual payment plus a generous tip for Sarah. Standing up, he felt every one of his 70-plus years, but he kept his spine straight, his movements deliberate. The other customers watched him go, a few nodding in respect, others looking away in embarrassment at their own earlier inaction. Outside, the night air had cooled considerably. John paused on the sidewalk, breathing in deeply. The street was quiet, peaceful, so different from the places that still haunted his dreams. He thought about Mike again, about the anger in the young man's eyes. There was pain there, hidden behind the arrogance and contempt. John had seen that look before, in mirrors and in the faces of men under his command. As he walked to his car, John's mind was already working, processing the evening's events with the tactical precision that had kept him alive in war zones. Mike's outburst hadn't just been about him. It was about something deeper, something that needed addressing. And John Willis hadn't survived all he'd survived just to let a moment like this pass without trying to make something better come from it. Tomorrow would be another day. And John had learned long ago that sometimes the best response to an attack wasn't a counterattack, but something else entirely, something that could turn an enemy into an ally, if you had the patience and wisdom to see it through. The diner's neon sign reflected off his car's windshield, casting alternating patterns of light and shadow. John started his engine, the familiar rumble grounding him in the present. Behind him, life in Tony's diner continued, the evening's drama already becoming tomorrow's story. But for John, it wasn't over. It was just the beginning of something that needed to be done, something that might help a young man find his way before his anger consumed him completely. Morning sunlight streamed through the precinct windows, casting long shadows across Mike Reynolds' desk. He nursed his second coffee of the day, trying to shake off the remnants of a restless night. Sleep hadn't come easy, his mind replaying the scene at the diner despite his best efforts to forget it. The office buzzed with its usual morning activity, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, officers shuffling papers and trading case notes. Mike had just started reviewing a case file when Officer Chin dropped a manila envelope on his desk. "Priority mail for you," Chin said, raising an eyebrow. "Came in first thing this morning." Mike frowned at the envelope. It wasn't unusual to get case-related mail, but something about this felt different. The envelope was heavy, expensive-looking, with his name and badge number typed precisely on the front. No return address. He sliced it open with his letter opener, and several photographs slid out onto his desk. The first one caught his eye immediately. A black and white shot, clearly from decades ago, showing a group of soldiers. They stood in front of a helicopter, dusty and battle-worn but standing tall. In the center, younger but unmistakable, stood John Willis. Mike's coffee grew cold as he examined the photo more closely. John wasn't just one of the soldiers. He was clearly the leader, his bearing evident even in this frozen moment of time. The other men looked to him, their body language showing a respect that couldn't be faked for a camera. More documents spilled out. Citations for valor. Medal recommendations. After-action reports that made Mike's most intense police encounters seem like playground scuffles. His hands began to shake slightly as he read about operations that weren't supposed to be declassified for another decade, missions that had shaped military history while remaining hidden from public view. One citation caught his eye. Captain John Willis, displaying extraordinary courage under extreme enemy fire, led a rescue operation that saved 18 wounded soldiers. Despite sustaining injuries, Captain Willis remained in command, coordinating air support and ensuring every member of his team returned safely. His actions reflect the highest traditions of military service. The words blurred together as Mike remembered his own sneering comments from the night before. He'd called John irrelevant, outdated. He'd dismissed decades of service with a few cruel sentences, all because he'd been angry about a reprimand from his supervisor. A shadow fell across his desk. Mike looked up to find Chief Allen standing there, his expression unreadable. The chief was an imposing figure on any day, but this morning he seemed to fill the entire doorway of Mike's cubicle. "Detective Reynolds," the chief said, his voice carefully neutral. "My office."
Now?
Mike's stomach dropped. In his 15 years on the force, he'd only been called to the chief's office 3 times. None of those occasions had been pleasant. He stood up, straightening his tie automatically, and followed Chief Allen through the bullpen. The walk felt longer than usual, each step carrying him closer to what he suspected would be a very uncomfortable conversation. Other officers glanced up as they passed, then quickly looked away. News traveled fast in a small-town precinct. Someone had obviously heard about last night's incident at the diner. The chief's office door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow sounded like a jail cell locking. Mike's breath caught in his throat as he saw who was waiting inside. John Willis sat in one of the visitor chairs, wearing a crisp suit that looked nothing like his usual diner attire. He stood as they entered, and Mike noticed something he'd missed at the diner. The straight spine, the squared shoulders, the unmistakable bearing of a commanding officer. "Detective Reynolds," John said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made Mike want to stand at attention. "Please have a seat." Mike sat, feeling like he was perching on the edge of a cliff. The chief settled behind his desk, leaving the 3 men in a triangle of tension. The morning sun through the window caught the medals pinned to John's lapel, not the old service pins from his jacket, but current, active honors that spoke of ongoing connection to the military community. "I believe," John began, "we got off on the wrong foot last night." He spoke without anger or accusation, just a simple statement of fact. "I thought we should clear the air, especially given our shared commitment to serving this community." Mike opened his mouth to speak, but John held up a hand. The gesture was gentle but carried enough authority that Mike found himself falling silent automatically. "Before you say anything, I want you to understand something." John leaned forward slightly. "I'm not here to complain about your behavior last night. I'm not here to get you in trouble or demand an apology. I'm here because I saw something in you that reminded me of another young man I once knew. Someone who had the same fire, the same need to prove himself, the same anger at a world that didn't seem to understand him." The chief remained silent, watching the interaction with keen interest. Mike shifted uncomfortably in his chair, feeling like he was being dissected by John's steady gaze. "That young man was me about 50 years ago," John continued. "Before I learned that true strength isn't about dominating others or proving your superiority. It's about lifting people up, about understanding that every generation has something to teach and something to learn. The words hit Mike like physical blows, each one chipping away at the armor of arrogance he'd built around himself. He thought about the photographs on his desk, the citations, the evidence of a life served in ways he couldn't have imagined. "Sir, Mike started, then stopped, realizing he had no idea what to say. John smiled slightly. "You don't need to say anything right now. Just listen. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about last night. It's about why I choose to sit in that diner, why I wear my service pins, and why I tell my stories to anyone willing to listen." For the next hour, John spoke about his experiences, not the glorified war stories Mike had expected, but raw, honest accounts of fear, loss, triumph, and growth. He talked about learning to lead, about making mistakes that cost lives, about carrying the weight of responsibility for others. The chief listened too, occasionally nodding as John described situations that paralleled their own law enforcement challenges. Mike found himself leaning forward, absorbed in accounts that shattered his preconceptions about both John and the generation he represented. As the morning light shifted across the office floor, Mike began to see his own recent behavior reflected in John's stories of youthful arrogance and costly mistakes. Each word seemed carefully chosen to build a bridge between their experiences, to show how the past and present were connected by common threads of service, sacrifice, and the ongoing struggle to do what's right. The lesson wasn't delivered with judgment or shame, but with understanding and a wisdom that made Mike's recent actions seem increasingly childish. By the time John finished speaking, the office felt different, not just physically, but as if the very air had been charged with possibility and potential for change. John's voice filled the chief's office, with stories that made Mike's throat tight. He described a night in Vietnam when his unit got pinned down in the jungle, rain pouring so hard they could barely see the enemy's muzzle flashes. 2 of his men were wounded, and John had to decide between waiting for backup or attempting a dangerous extraction. "I was 25, John said, his eyes focused on something distant. "Not much younger than you are now, Detective. I had to carry Tommy Martinez through half a mile of hostile territory. He kept telling me to leave him, that I was risking everyone else's lives. But that's not how it works. You don't leave people behind, even when they think they're not worth saving." Mike shifted in his chair, the parallel to his own situation uncomfortably clear. He'd been leaving people behind his whole career, dismissing them as irrelevant or obstacles to his version of progress. The realization sat like a stone in his stomach. "We lost 3 good men that night," John continued, his voice steady but heavy with memory. "I wrote letters to their families, had to tell them their sons died heroes, when what I really wanted to say was that they died because of my choices. Those letters, they stay with you. Every word, every promise to those families. You carry them with you, learn from them, let them shape you into someone better than you were." Chief Allen nodded slowly, his own experience with difficult decisions evident in his expression. Mike found himself wondering how many similar letters the chief had written over his career, how many tough calls he'd had to make while Mike criticized his leadership from the sidelines. "But here's what I learned," John said, leaning forward slightly. "Leadership isn't about being right all the time. It's about being willing to learn from your mistakes, to listen to those who've walked the path before you, and to understand that strength comes in many forms." The words should have been comforting, an olive branch extended across the generational divide. Instead, Mike felt his defenses rising again. He'd worked hard to get where he was, fought for every promotion, earned his detective's badge through dedication and results. The idea that he might have been wrong about his approach, that his methods might need changing, it threatened everything he'd built his identity around. "With all due respect, sir," Mike said, his voice tighter than he intended, "times have changed. The challenges we face today are different. We can't afford to be soft, to worry about everyone's feelings while criminals walk free." The moment the words left his mouth, Mike knew he'd made another mistake. The chief's expression darkened, but it was John's response that cut deepest. "You think facing armed enemies with nothing but a rifle and your wits is soft?" John asked quietly. "You think writing letters to grieving mothers requires less courage than kicking down doors?" Detective Reynolds, you're so focused on proving your toughness that you've forgotten what true strength looks like. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Outside the chief's office, phones rang and officers went about their daily routines, but inside, time seemed to stand still. Mike stared at his hands, unable to meet either man's gaze. I had an officer like you once, Chief Allen spoke up, breaking the tension. Thought being tough meant being feared. Thought respect came from authority rather than earning it. Want to know where he is now? Mike looked up to spite himself. Working security at the mall, the chief continued. Lost his badge after one too many complaints about excessive force. He was a good cop in many ways, smart, dedicated, got results. But he never learned that police work is about more than just catching bad guys. It's about serving the community. All of it, even the parts you don't understand or agree with. John nodded, a small gesture of agreement. In the military, we had a saying, mission first, people always. Notice it's not mission only. The people, your team, your community, even those you're fighting, they matter. Because at the end of the day, what are we protecting if not people's? Mike felt the weight of their combined experience pressing down on him. He wanted to argue, to defend his methods, to explain how his toughness had solved cases and put criminals behind bars. But something held him back. Maybe the memory of John's quiet dignity in the diner, or the stories of sacrifice he'd just heard, or simply the growing realization that he might have been wrong about more than just one old veteran. I'm not saying your methods don't get results, John added, as if reading Mike's thoughts. I'm saying there might be better ways to achieve the same goals. Ways that don't require burning bridges or creating enemies out of potential allies. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the office floor. Mike thought about his father, another veteran he'd dismissed as outdated and irrelevant. How many bridges had he burned in his determination to prove himself? The hardest part of growing, John said softly, is admitting that you still have growing to do. Trust me, I learned that lesson the hard way, and I see you fighting the same battle I once fought with myself. Mike opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. What could he say? His usual defenses felt hollow in the face of John's quiet wisdom and the chief's pointed example. The certainty he'd carried about his methods, about his superiority over the old guard, had developed cracks he couldn't ignore. I think, the chief said, glancing at his watch, we all have duties to attend to. Detective Reynolds, I expect a full report on the Martinez case by end of day. Mr. Willis, thank you for coming in. The meeting was clearly over, but Mike felt suspended between two worlds, the one he'd built for himself, full of rigid certainties and clear divisions, and a new one that was starting to take shape, more complex, but perhaps more real. As they stood to leave, John paused at the door. Detective, he said, if you're ever interested in hearing more about that night in the jungle, or any other stories that might seem irrelevant to modern police work, you know where to find me. The offer hung in the air, neither a command nor a challenge, but a chance for something different. Mike nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and watched as John walked out of the office with the same quiet dignity he'd shown in the diner. Mike spent the afternoon staring at his computer screen, the Martinez case report barely touched. His mind kept wandering back to John's stories, to the quiet strength in his voice when he talked about carrying wounded men through enemy territory. The words on Mike's screen blurred as another memory surfaced, his own father trying to tell him about his military service, while teenage Mike rolled his eyes and made excuses to leave the room. The office emptied gradually as the day shift wound down. Evening shift officers drifted in, nodding to Mike as they passed his desk. He barely noticed them, lost in thoughts that seemed determined to unravel everything he believed about himself. His phone buzzed, a text from his father. Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay? Mike stared at the message, remembering John's words about bridges burned and connections lost. When was the last time he'd actually talked to his dad? Really talked, not just the perfunctory holiday phone calls and occasional text messages? Detective Reynolds? Officer Chen's voice startled him. You planning to camp out here all night? Mike looked up, surprised to find the office almost dark, lit only by his desk lamp and the glow of his computer screen. Chen stood there with her coat on, keys in hand, concern evident in her expression. "Just finishing up," Mike mumbled, though they both knew he hadn't typed a word in hours. "Heard about what happened at the diner," Chen said carefully. "And about this morning's meeting with the chief." Of course she had. Nothing stayed secret for long in a department this size. Mike waited for judgment or criticism, but Chen just watched him with understanding in her eyes. "You know," she said, "my grandfather fought in Korea. Never talked about it much, but he had this way of looking at people like he could see right through their tough guy act to whatever was hurting inside. Reminded me of Mr. Willis." Actually, Mike's throat tightened. He thought about John's steady gaze in the chief's office, how it had seemed to pierce right through his defenses. "Yeah," he managed. "I think I know what you mean." Chun hesitated, then pulled something from her pocket, a business card. "My grandfather's VA support group meets on Thursdays. Lots of vets from different eras. They talk about things civilian folks like us might never understand, but they're always willing to share their wisdom." She placed the card on his desk. "Just thought you might be interested." After Chen left, Mike sat in the growing darkness, turning the card over in his hands. The Martinez report could wait until morning. Right now, he had something more important to deal with. The drive to Tony's diner felt longer than usual. Every traffic light seemed determined to turn red, giving Mike more time to second-guess himself. What would he say? How do you apologize for something that went beyond just words, for dismissing not just a person, but everything they represented? The diner's neon sign cast multicolored reflections on his windshield as Mike pulled into the parking lot. Through the windows, he could see the usual evening crowd. John sat at his regular table, alone with his coffee and what looked like a piece of pie. Mike's hand shook slightly as he reached for the door handle. He forced himself to take a deep breath, remembering John's story about carrying wounded men through the jungle. If John could face enemy fire, surely Mike could face his own mistakes. The bell above the door chimed as he entered. Conversations died mid-sentence as heads turned to look at him. Sarah, the waitress, stopped mid-pour at a nearby table, coffee pot hovering uncertainly above a customer's cup. Tony emerged from the kitchen, his expression stormy. Mike ignored them all, focusing on the figure by the window. John looked up as Mike approached, his face unreadable in the diner's fluorescent lighting. For a moment, Mike saw him as he must have looked in that old photograph, younger, but with the same steady presence that commanded respect without demanding it. "Mr. Willis," Mike said, his voice rougher than he intended. The words he'd rehearsed in his car seemed to evaporate. "How do you apologize for being completely wrong about everything?" John gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Have a seat, detective." "Sarah, could we get another coffee over here?" Mike sat, aware of the other customers pretending not to watch. Sarah brought the coffee quickly and retreated, leaving the two men in a bubble of awkward silence. "I was wrong," Mike finally managed. The words came out in a rush, like a dam breaking. "Not just about last night, but about everything. About you, about what you represent, about..." He swallowed hard. "About thinking I had nothing to learn from people who came before me." John took a sip of his coffee, giving Mike time to find his next words. "The things you told me this morning, about your experiences..." Mike stared into his untouched coffee. "I've spent so much time trying to prove I'm tough enough, smart enough, that I forgot what real strength looks like, what real service means." A hint of a smile touched John's lips. "Admitting you're wrong takes more courage than being right ever did," he said quietly. "Took me a long time to learn that lesson myself." The tension in Mike's shoulders eased slightly. He reached for his coffee, took a sip of the familiar bitter brew that somehow tasted better than usual. Around them, the diner's normal buzz of conversation gradually resumed. "I can't take back what I said," Mike continued, "but I'd like to learn. About your experiences, about what you and others like you can teach me. If you're willing to share." John studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thursday nights," he said. "A bunch of us old-timers meet at the VA, share stories, support each other. You'd be welcome to join us if you're interested." Mike pulled Chen's card from his pocket, placed it on the table. "Already got the address," he said, managing a small smile. Tony appeared with 2 slices of apple pie, setting them down without a word. but his expression had softened, the anger replaced by something that looked like approval. As they ate, John began telling another story, this one about a young lieutenant who thought he knew everything until a seasoned sergeant taught him otherwise. Mike listened, really listened, beginning to understand that sometimes the greatest victories come not from being right, but from being willing to learn how wrong you've been. The VA meeting room smelled of coffee and old linoleum, fluorescent lights humming overhead as veterans of different eras gathered in their usual circle of folding chairs. Mike sat near the door, feeling out of place in his civilian clothes, watching John interact with the other vets. It had been 3 weeks since their confrontation at the diner, and each Thursday night found Mike here, listening and learning. Tonight's topic was leadership under pressure. A Desert Storm vet named Ray was describing a sandstorm that had separated his unit from their convoy. Mike found himself leaning forward, caught up in the way Ray's hands moved as he talked, the way the other vets nodded in understanding at parts civilians might have missed. You can plan everything perfect, Ray was saying, but when that storm hits, when visibility drops to zero and your equipment's failing, that's when you learn what kind of leader you really are. John caught Mike's eye across the circle, a slight nod acknowledging the parallel to police work. Mike had started seeing these connections more often lately, the similarities between different kinds of service, the common threads that ran through their experiences despite the decades between them. After the meeting, Mike helped stack chairs while John chatted with some of the newer veterans, kids really, some just back from Afghanistan and Iraq, carrying wounds that weren't all visible. Mike watched how John handled them, the way he knew when to push and when to back off, when to share his own experiences, and when to just listen. Coffee? John asked as the last veteran left, jingling his car keys. Tony's is still open. They'd fallen into this routine, late-night conversations at the diner after VA meetings. Mike found himself looking forward to these talks more than he'd ever expected. They drove separately, the familiar neon sign of Tony's guiding them like a beacon through the quiet streets. The diner was nearly empty at this hour. Sarah, working the late shift, brought their usual orders without being asked. Black coffee for John, coffee with cream for Mike, and a slice of apple pie to share. The pie had become their tradition, though neither of them had actually discussed it. You were quiet tonight, John observed, stirring his coffee even though he never added anything to it. Ray's story hit home. Mike nodded slowly. Made me think about that domestic violence call last week. Everything went by the book until it didn't. Had to make split-second decisions, just like Ray in that sandstorm. Lives depending on getting it right. And did you get it right? I think so. At least nobody got hurt. But Mike paused, organizing his thoughts. 6 months ago, I would have gone in hard, taken control by force. Instead, I remembered what you said about strength coming in different forms. Talked the guy down instead of taking him down. Kept everyone safer in the process. John smiled slightly, the expression barely visible in the diner's late-night lighting. Sounds like you're learning. Yeah, well, Mike broke off a piece of pie, pushing it around on the plate. Got a good teacher? Their conversations had evolved over the weeks, moving beyond war stories and police work to deeper territories. Mike found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, his fears about measuring up, the pressure he put on himself to be perfect, the way he'd pushed people away to avoid showing weakness. You know what I've noticed? John said, watching a late-night truck rumble past the diner's window. The toughest guys I knew in combat weren't the ones who never showed fear. They were the ones who admitted they were scared but did what needed doing anyway. Mike thought about his father again, about all the conversations they'd never had. I called my dad last week, he said suddenly. First real talk we've had in years. Told him about these meetings, about what I'm learning from you and the others. How'd that go? He cried. Mike's voice caught slightly. Never seen my dad cry before. Said he'd been waiting years for me to be ready to listen. We talked for 3 hours about his service, about why he became a cop after Vietnam, about... He swallowed hard. About how proud he is of me. Even when he disagrees with my methods. John nodded, understanding in his eyes. Bridges rebuild stronger sometimes if you use the right materials. The night deepened around them, the diner's lights creating a small island of warmth in the darkness. Sarah refilled their cups without asking, her movements quiet and practiced. Mike had noticed the diner staff treated him differently now, not with the fearful respect they'd shown before, but with something warmer, more genuine. The guys at the station have noticed a change too, Mike admitted. Chun, the officer who gave me the VA group card, she said I seem more grounded. Said a suspect actually thanked me after an arrest last week. Can you believe that? Respect earned freely is worth more than respect demanded, John said. Took me 2 tours to learn that lesson. You're ahead of schedule, Mike chuckled, then grew serious. I've been thinking about what you said, about carrying the weight of command decisions. About those letters you had to write to families. He traced the rim of his coffee cup with one finger. I've got this case I'm working. Young kid caught up in something bad. Everyone's pushing for a hard approach. But you're seeing another way? Maybe. It'll be more work, take more time, but if we can turn him around instead of just locking him up. Mike shrugged. Guess you're rubbing off on me? John's eyes crinkled at the corners. Leadership isn't about having all the answers, Mike. It's about being willing to look for better questions. The use of his first name didn't go unnoticed. They'd crossed some invisible line in their relationship, moving from reluctant teacher and student to something closer to friends. Mike found he didn't mind the change. Tony appeared from the kitchen, starting his closing routine. Neither man made a move to leave, though. These quiet moments had become precious, a time to reflect, to share, to understand each other across the decades that separated their experiences. Next week's meeting, John said as they finally stood to leave, one of our World War II vets is speaking. 93 years old and sharp as a tack. Thought you might be interested. Mike nodded, already knowing he wouldn't miss it. He'd learned more about real strength in these late-night conversations than in all his years of trying to prove himself. Some lessons, it turned out, could only be learned by first admitting you had something to learn. The late summer afternoon had started quietly enough. Mike and John sat at their usual table in Tony's diner, sharing lunch instead of their typical late-night coffee. Mike was describing a complicated case he was working on, appreciating how John asked just the right questions to help him see new angles. Sometimes you've got to step back, John was saying. Look at the whole battlefield before dash. He stopped mid-sentence, his head turning sharply toward the window. Mike recognized that look, the instant shift from relaxed veteran to alert commander. Following John's gaze, he saw smoke rising from the hardware store across the street. They were both moving before the first shouts for help reached the diner. Outside, the smoke had already thickened, black and oily against the blue sky. A small crowd had gathered, phones out, recording instead of helping. Mike automatically reached for his radio before remembering he was off duty. Call it in, John said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority Mike had heard in his war stories. Then help me get these people back. That's not regular smoke, something chemicals burning. Mike pulled out his phone, calling dispatch while John began organizing the bystanders. The transformation was remarkable. Gone was the quiet old veteran who sat drinking coffee. In his place stood a commander who'd led men through worse situations than this. You in the blue shirt, John called out to a young man. Get to the intersection. Direct traffic away from this block. Young lady with the red hair. Find out if anyone's seen old Joe who runs the store. The rest of you, back up past that telephone pole. Those fumes aren't safe to breathe. People responded automatically to the authority in his voice. Even teenagers who normally ignored everyone put their phones down and moved back. Mike finished his call, fire department was 5 minutes out, and joined John, who was already assessing the situation with practiced eyes. Storage rooms in the back, John said, pointing to where the smoke seemed thickest. Joe keeps paint thinner and other chemicals there. If the fire reaches those, a woman pushed through the crowd. My daughter, she screamed. She was just going in to buy school supplies. Mike caught John's eye. They both knew 5 minutes could be too long to wait. The smoke was getting thicker, and now they could see orange flames flickering behind the store's front windows. How many entrances? John asked, already removing his jacket. Main door and back delivery entrance, Mike answered. I've been there for cases before, right? John's voice shifted to what Mike now recognized as his command tone. Here's what we're going to do. You take the back entrance. Less smoke there. I'll go through the front. Anyone we find, we move them toward the middle of the store where we can see each other. No heroics, no getting separated. Clear? Mike nodded, struck by how naturally he fell into following John's lead. Despite being the younger man, the active law enforcement officer, he knew without doubt that John was the right person to take charge here. The heat hit them as they approached the building. John had already organized several bystanders into a bucket brigade, using water from a nearby restaurant's kitchen to keep the sidewalk wet and prevent the fire from spreading. Others he tasked with gathering information about who might be inside and where. Remember, John said as they prepared to enter, communication is key. You see something, you call it out. You need help, you yell. No exceptions. Mike nodded, thinking how different this was from his old approach of charging in alone to prove himself. They split up, Mike heading for the back entrance while John approached the front door. The smoke had grown so thick that Mike lost sight of him almost immediately. Inside, the heat was intense, but the back entrance had better visibility. Mike moved carefully, calling out for survivors while keeping track of his position relative to where he thought John would be. He could hear John's voice doing the same from the front of the store. A cough answered his calls. Mike found the teenage girl huddled behind a display case, along with old Joe, who'd been trying to help her find the exit. The smoke had disoriented them both. Mike guided them toward the center of the store, remembering John's instructions about maintaining contact. "John," he called out. "Found them. Center aisle. Coming to you." John's voice answered, then broke into a cough. The smoke was getting worse. They met in the middle of the store, John already orchestrating their exit. "Joe, you know where every display is. Lead the way to the back door. Mike, support the girl. I'll cover our rear and make sure nobody gets separated." The organization of it struck Mike, how John had instantly assessed everyone's strengths and assigned roles accordingly. Joe's knowledge of the store layout, Mike's physical strength to help the teenager, John watching their backs like he must have done countless times in combat. They emerged into sunlight and fresh air just as the first fire truck arrived, sirens wailing. John immediately began briefing the fire chief, describing the store's layout and where the dangerous chemicals were stored. His voice was hoarse from the smoke, but he didn't stop until he'd shared every detail that might help the firefighters. The girl was reunited with her mother, and paramedics checked over Joe, who refused to leave until he'd made sure everyone was safe. The fire department managed to contain the blaze before it reached the chemical storage, thanks largely to John's quick warning about its location. Mike watched as John quietly stepped back once the professionals took over, becoming once again the unassuming veteran that most people saw. But now Mike knew better. He'd seen the other side of John. The leader who could take charge of chaos and turn it into ordered action. The commander who knew how to use each person's strengths. The hero who thought first of others' safety before his own. Later, after the excitement died down and the crowd dispersed, they sat on a bench across from the smoldering building, accepting bottles of water from a grateful Tony. The fire chief had already been by to thank them, particularly praising John's quick organization of the bucket brigade that had prevented the fire from spreading. "Just like old times," John said quietly, his voice still rough from the smoke. Though the jungle never burned quite so hot. Mike looked at him with new understanding. "You never stopped being a leader, did you? You just changed battlefields." John smiled slightly. "Every day gives us chances to serve, Mike. Sometimes it's as dramatic as running into a burning building. Sometimes it's as simple as showing respect to a young detective who needs to learn a few things." The sun was setting behind the buildings, casting long shadows across the street. Fire investigators moved around the hardware store, documenting evidence and taking photos. Life would go on, the store would rebuild, and most people would soon forget the excitement of the day. But Mike knew he'd never forget what he'd seen. The transformation of a quiet veteran into a commanding presence that saved lives. The seamless way John had taken charge without ego or hesitation. The lessons in leadership that no academy training could provide. In those moments of crisis, Mike had seen what real strength looked like, and it had nothing to do with authority or power. It was about serving others, using your experience to protect and guide, leading by example rather than force. The radio on a nearby fire truck crackled with updates and all clears. John stood up, brushing ash from his clothes. "Think Tony's got any pie left?" he asked, as if they hadn't just run into a burning building together. "Could use something sweet after all that smoke." Mike laughed, the sound carrying a new appreciation for the man beside him. "Pretty sure he'll find us a slice or two," he said, standing to follow John back to the diner. "After all, we've got some stories to tell tonight." The day after the fire, Mike arrived at Tony's diner with a renewed sense of purpose. He felt a quiet gratitude, not just for John's courage during the fire, but for the quiet, transformative lessons he had imparted over the past weeks. As he entered the diner, the usual patrons watched, curious to see how the once dismissive detective would greet the man he had insulted not so long ago. Mike walked straight to John's table, his expression earnest and humble. "John," he began, pausing to find the right words, "thank you for everything. Not just for what you did yesterday, but for giving me a second chance I probably didn't deserve." John nodded, his wise gaze revealing that he understood exactly what Mike meant. He had seen the young man's growth firsthand, noting how Mike had listened to his stories, asking questions, and absorbing the lessons with a quiet respect. For John, Mike's transformation was a testament to his own belief that people could change when given the chance. The other patrons, who had witnessed Mike's initial treatment of John, were astonished by the depth of the friendship that had blossomed between the two men. People around town spoke about the once cocky detective's transformation, noting his more patient approach to others, a new openness and willingness to understand their struggles rather than judge. Tony, the diner's owner, often recounted to newcomers how Mike's journey had inspired everyone who frequented the diner. It became a story about respect and redemption, a reminder of the dignity and strength in unexpected friendships. Mike's change was so significant that it rippled through his professional life as well. When he returned to the station, he began to handle cases with a newfound empathy, listening to the people who came through the doors with the same patience he had learned from John. This shift didn't go unnoticed. His colleagues saw the difference, and the townspeople, once wary of him, began to view him with respect and trust. One day, as Mike sat with John over a late lunch, he found himself talking about his own life, a childhood spent with a strict father, his intense drive to prove himself, and how he'd always equated respect with authority. "But I was wrong," he admitted quietly. "Respect isn't about power. It's about understanding what others have endured."
"You taught me that."
John gave him a knowing smile, the same calm, accepting expression that had, in so many ways, anchored Mike's journey of self-reflection. Months passed, and Mike's continued friendship with John became a source of hope for others in town. It was clear that Mike no longer saw John as an old-timer, but as a mentor whose stories and resilience had changed him. Now, he carried John's lessons with him, embracing the values of kindness, humility, and respect in his daily interactions. Mike even began to attend community events and veterans gatherings, honoring John's legacy by showing up and actively supporting the local veterans he had once overlooked. One evening, during a community event celebrating local veterans, John was presented with a plaque for his years of service and his unwavering dedication to the community. As he accepted it, he looked out into the crowd and, catching Mike's eye, raised a hand in a silent salute. For Mike, it was a powerful moment, one that cemented his respect for the man who had guided him toward a better version of himself. From that day on, Mike carried himself differently, realizing that true strength came not from wielding power but from building trust, and that respect was something one earned through humility and compassion. The once hard-edged detective had come full circle, and his friendship with John became a symbol in the town, a testament to how much people could change when they allowed themselves to learn from others. In his heart, Mike knew that he was a better man because of John, and he felt a deep gratitude that would carry him through every challenge he would face in the years to come.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.